The Open Window by Saki. In this masterful tale, a nervous man arrives for a formal call, bearing a letter of introduction. Greeted by the niece of his intended hostess, he finds himself drawn into an unsettling conversation. As they await the lady of the house, the young girl recounts a tale of family tragedy, casting a shadow over the pleasant autumn afternoon. Despite his best efforts, the visitor finds his eyes straying to the open window, unable to shake off a growing sense of unease. This short story is accompanied by another short story this week, The Return by R. Murray Gilchrist, a Gothic tale set in the Derbyshire moorland, where some promises are kept and others are broken. Join me, Tony Walker, and the Classic Ghost Stories podcast.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody
The Open Window by Saki. I don't normally say this, but the noise you can hear in the background, well, it's the heavy rain. It's forecast to continue all day and possibly all night and possibly all tomorrow, so I simply don't have any other time to do this. I hope you will enjoy it nevertheless. So, The Open Window by Saki. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nurrell, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. I know how it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, are quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Do you know many of the people round here? Asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. It's quite warm for the time of year, said Frampton, but has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Poor aunt always thinks that they'll come back some day, they and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window, just as they used to do. That is why the window's kept open every evening till it's quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she's often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they'll all walk through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera's been amusing you," she said. "She's been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Stapleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visits on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who laboured under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No?" said Mrs. Stapleton in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for tea. Don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Stapleton. "Could only talk about his illness, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he'd seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs, and had to spend a night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance at short notice was her speciality. Well, that had been requested by a listener, and I've wanted to do it for quite a long time, but it is very short, and I don't want you to feel cheated, so I'm going to do another short one. Not by Saki, but by R. Murray Gilchrist. This is called The Return. You'll hear that it's still raining. The Return by R. Murray Gilchrist. 5 minutes ago I drew the curtain aside and let the mellow sunset light contend with the glare from the girandoles. Below lay the orchard of Vernon Garth, rich in heavily flowered fruit trees. Yonder a medlar, here a pear, next a quince. As my eyes, unaccustomed to the day, blinked rapidly, the recollection came of a scene 45 years past, and once more, beneath the oldest tree, stood the girl I loved, mischievously plucking yarrow, and, despite its evil omen, twining the snowy clusters in her black hair. Again her coquettish words rang in my ears. "Make me thy lady, make me the richest woman in England, and I promise thee, Brian, we shall be the happiest of God's creatures." And I remember how the mad thirst for gold filled me. how I trusted in her fidelity, and without reasoning or even telling her that I would conquer fortune for her sake, I kissed her sadly and passed into the world. Then followed a complete silence until the star of Europe, the greatest diamond discovered in modern times, lay in my hand. A rough, unpolished stone, not unlike the lumps of spar I had often seen lying on the sandy lanes of my native county. This should be Rose's own, and all the others that clanked so melodiously in their leather bulse should go towards fulfilling her ambition. Rich and happy I should be soon, and should I not marry an untitled gentlewoman sweet in her prime. The 20 years' interval of work and sleep was like a fading dream, for I was going home. The knowledge thrilled me so that my nerves were strung tight as iron ropes, and I laughed like a young boy. And it was all because my home was to be in Rose Pascal's arms. I crossed the sea and posted straight for Halkerton village. The old hostelry was crowded. Jane Hopgarth, whom I remembered a ruddy-faced child, stood on the box-edged terrace, curtsying in matronly fashion to the departing mail coach. A change in the signboard drew my eye. The white lilies had been painted over with a mitre, and the name changed from the Paschal Arms to the Lord Bishop. Angrily aghast at this disloyalty, I cross-questioned the ostlers who hurried to and fro, but failing to obtain any coherent reply, I was fain to content myself with a mental denunciation of the times. At last I saw bow-legged Jeffreys, now bent double with age, sunning himself at his favourite place, the side of the horse-trough. As of old, he was chewing a straw. No sign of recognition came over his face as he gazed at me, and I was shocked because I wished to impart some of my gladness to a fellow creature. I went to him, and after trying in vain to make him speak, held forth a gold coin. He rose instantly, grasped it with palsied fingers, and muttering that the hounds were starting, hurried from my presence. Feeling half sad, I crossed to the churchyard and gazed through the gated window of the Pascal burial chamber at the recumbent and undisturbed effigies of Geoffrey Pascal, gentleman of Bretton Hall, and Margaret Maltrevor, his wife, with their quaint epitaph about a perfect marriage enduring for ever. Then, after noting the rankness of the docks and nettles, I crossed the worn stile, and with footsteps surprisingly fleet, passed towards the stretch of moorland at whose further end stands Bretton Hall. Twilight had fallen ere I reached the cottage at the entrance of the park. This was in ruinous condition. Here and there sheaves in the thatched roof had parted and formed crevices through which smoke filtered. Some of the tiny windows had been walled up, and even where the glass remained, snake-like ivy hindered any light from falling into their thick recesses. The door stood open, although the evening was chill. As I approached, the heavy autumnal dew shook down from the firs and fell upon my shoulders. A bat, swooping in an undulation, struck between my eyes and fell to the grass, moaning querulously. I entered. A withered woman sat beside the peat fire. She held a pair of steel knitting needles, which she moved without cessation. There was no thread upon them, and when they clicked, her lips twitched as if she had counted. Some time passed before I recognized Rose's foster-mother, Elizabeth Careless. The russet colour of her cheeks had faded and left a sickly grey. Those sunken, dimmed eyes were utterly unlike the bright black orbs that had danced so mirthfully. Her stature, too, had shrunk. I was struck with wonder. Elizabeth could not be more than 56 years old. I had been away 20 years. Rose was 15 when I had left her, and I heard Elizabeth say that she was only 21 at the time of her darling's weaning. But what a change! She had such an air of weary grief that my heart grew sick. Advancing to her side, I touched her arm. She turned, but neither spoke nor seemed aware of my presence. Soon, however, she rose, and helping herself along by grasping the scanty furniture, tottered to a window and peered out. Her right hand crept to her throat. She untied the string of her gown and took from her bosom a pomander set in a battered silver case. I cried out. Rose had loved that toy in her childhood. Thousands of times we had played ball with it. Elizabeth held it to her mouth and mumbled it as if it were a baby's hand. Maddened with impatience, I caught her shoulder and roughly bade her say where I should find Rose. But something awoke in her eyes, and she shrank away to the other side of the house-place. I followed. She cowered on the floor, looking at me with a strange horror. Her lips began to move, but they made no sound. Only when I crossed to the threshold did she rise, and then her head moved wildly from side to side, and her hands pressed close to her breast, as if the pain there were too great to endure. I ran from the place, not daring to look back. In a few minutes I reached the balustraded wall of the hall garden. The vegetation there was wonderfully luxuriant. As of old, the great blue and white Canterbury bells grew thickly, and those curious flowers to which tradition has given the name of Marie's heart still spread their creamy tendrils and blood-coloured bloom on every hand. But Pascal's dribble, the tiny spring whose water pulsed so fiercely as it emerged from the earth, had long since burst its bounds, and converted the winter garden into a swamp, where a miniature forest of Queen of the Meadow filled the air with melancholy sweetness. The house looked as if no careful hand had touched it for years. The elements had played havoc with its oriels, and many of the latticed frames hung on single hinges. The curtain of the blue parlour hung outside, draggled and faded and half hidden by a thick growth of bindweed. With an almost savage force I raised my arm high above my head and brought down my fist upon the central panel of the door. There was no need for such violence, for the decayed fastenings made no resistance, and some of the rotten boards fell to the ground. As I entered the hall, and saw the ancient furniture, once so fondly kept, now mildewed and crumbling to dust, quick sobs burst from my throat. Rose's spinet stood beside the door of the withdrawing-room. How many carols had we sung to its music! As I passed, my foot struck one of the legs, and the rickety structure groaned as if it were coming to pieces. I thrust out my hand to steady it, but at my touch the velvet covering of the lid came off, and the tiny gilt ornaments rattled downwards. The moon was just rising, and only half her disk was visible over the distant edge of the hell garden. The light in the room was very uncertain, yet I could see that the keys of the instrument were stained brown and bound together with thick cobwebs. Whilst I stood beside it, I felt an overpowering desire to play a country ballad with an overword of willow brow-bound. The words, in strict accordance with the melody, are merry and sad by turns, at one time filled with light happiness, at another bitter as the voice of one bereaved for ever of joy. So I cleared off the spiders and began to strike the keys with my forefinger. Many were dumb, and when I struck them gave forth no sound save a peculiar sigh, but still the melody rhythmed as distinctly as if a low voice crooned it out of the darkness. Wearied by bitterness, I turned away. By now the full moonlight pierced the window and quivered on the floor. As I gazed on the tremulous pattern, it changed into quaint devices of hearts, daggers, rings, and 1,000 tokens more. All suddenly another object glided amongst them so quickly that I wondered whether my eyes had been at fault. A tiny satin shoe, stained crimson across the lappets. A revulsion of feeling came to my soul and drove away all my fear. I had seen that self-same shoe, white and unsoiled, 20 years before, when vain Rose danced among her reapers at the harvest home. And my voice cried out in ecstasy, "Rose, heart of mine, delight of all the world's delights!" She stood before me, wondering, amazed. Alas, so changed. The red and yellow silk shawl still covered her shoulders. Her hair still hung in those eldritch curls, but the beautiful face had grown wan and tired, and across the forehead lines were drawn like silver threads. She threw her arms around my neck and, pressing her bosom heavily on mine, sobbed so piteously that I grew afraid for her. and drew back the long masses of hair which had fallen forward, and kissed again and again those lips that were too lovely for simile. Never came a word of chiding from them. "Love," she said, when she had regained her breath, "the past struggle was sharp and torturing. The future struggle will be crueler still. What a great love was yours, to wait and trust for so long. Would that mine had been as powerful. Poor weak heart that could not endure." The tones of a wild fear throbbed through all her speech, strongly, yet with insufficient power to prevent her feeling the tenderness of those moments. Often, timorously raising her head from my shoulder, she looked about, and then turned with a soft, inarticulate, and glad murmur to hide her face on my bosom. I spoke fervently, told of the years spent away from her, how, when working in the diamond fields, she had been ever present in my fancy, how at night her name had fallen from my lips in my only prayer, how I had dreamed of her amongst the greatest in the land, the richest, and I dare swear the loveliest woman in the world. I grew warmer still. All the gladness which had been constrained for so long now burst wildly from my lips, a myriad of rich ideas resolved into words, which, being spoken, wove one long and delicious fit of passion. As we stood together, the moon brightened and filled the chamber with a light like the day's. The ridges of the surrounding moorlands stood out in sharp relief. Rose drank in my declarations thirstily, but soon interrupted me with a heavy sigh. "Come away," she said softly. "I no longer live in this house. You must stay with me tonight. This place is so wretched now, for time that in you and me has only strengthened love, has wrought much ruin here." Half leaning on me, she led me from the precincts of Bretton Hall. We walked in silence over the waste that crowns the valley of the White Lands, and, being near the verge of the rocks, saw the great pine woods sloping downwards, lighted near us by the moon, but soon lost in density. Along the mysterious line where the light changed into gloom, intricate shadows of withered summer bracken struck and receded in a mimic battle. Before us lay the Priest's Cliff. The moon was veiled by a grove of elms, whose ever-swaying branches alternately increased and lessened her brightness. This was a place of notoriety, a veritable Golgotha, a haunt fit only for demons. Murder and theft had been punished here, and to this day fireside stories are told of evil women dancing round that druid circle, carrying hearts plucked from gibbeted bodies. "Rose," I whispered, "why have you brought me here?" She made no reply, but pressed her head more closely to my shoulder. Scarce had my lips closed, ere a sound, like the hiss of a half-strangled snake, vibrated amongst the trees. It grew louder and louder. A monstrous shadow hovered above. Rose from my bosom murmured, "Love is strong as death. Love is strong as death." I locked her in my arms so tightly that she grew breathless. "Hold me," she panted. "You're strong." A cold hand touched our foreheads so that, benumbed, we sank together to the ground, to fall instantly into a dreamless slumber. When I awoke, the clear grey light of early morning had spread over the country. Beyond the Hell Garden, the sun was just bursting through the clouds, and had already spread a long golden haze along the horizon. The babbling of the streamlet that runs down to Holkton was so distinct that it seemed almost at my side. How sweetly the wild thyme smelt! Filled with the tender recollections of the night, without turning, I called Rose Pascal from her sleep. "Sweetheart, sweetheart, waken, 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 see how glad the world looks, see the omens of a happy future." No answer came. I sat up, and looking round me, saw that I was alone. A square stone lay near. When the sun was high, I crept to read the inscription carved thereon. Here, at 4 cross paths, lieth, with a stake through the bosom, the body of Rose Pascal, who in her 16th year wilfully cast away the life God gave. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. So that was 2 stories whose only connection... Well, there are a couple of connections, actually. The short, they are bordering on the supernatural. Certainly the second one is supernatural, the first one is not supernatural but pretends to be, or leads us down that alleyway, doesn't it? Leads us down the garden path a little bit. They were very near contemporaries, in fact almost bang on contemporaries. So Robert Murray Gilchrist, second story author, was born 1868 and died in 1917, whereas Hector Hugh Munro, whose nom de plume was Saki, was born 1870, 2 years after Robert Murray Gilchrist, and died 1916, so the year before. Let's say something about Saki first. So he was born in December 1870 in Akya, Burma, which was part of the British Empire at the time, and his parents were British colonial whatever you call them, settlers, I don't know. He was a satirist and a writer known for his witty and sometimes macabre, I believe some of you say, satirical short stories. So his mother, weirdly, was killed by a runaway cow. And then he and his brothers and sisters, his siblings, were sent to England to be raised by their grandmother and aunts. Not ants, as in crawly things with legs, but his mother's sister. This strict, repressive upbringing would later influence his satirical take on Edwardian society and its conventions. In his youth, he travelled extensively in Europe. He began a career as a journalist and historian. He wrote for papers like the Westminster Gazette, the Daily Express, the Morning Post, which is a Communist Party paper. Weirdly, his first book, The Rise of the Russian Empire, was published in 1900. And it was that year that he took the pen name Saki. And people have, there are 2 theories about this. One is it's the name of a South American monkey species, which it might be, I didn't know. And the other one is it may be from the name of a character in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was a very popular poem at that. It was a great poem, of course, and very popular at that time in translation in English. So sardonic wit, surprise endings, and a somewhat cruel humour. So in his endings, he's a bit like O. Henry, you know, the American short story writer who loved twist endings. And Saki also, these twist endings. And this is an absolute classic version of it, isn't it? Often cruel. And we see this young woman in a time when people write stories, and I think people still are the same now, authors, they either deliberately make a character brutishly cruel or horrible, or even cleverly cruel. I think of Hannibal Lecter, I suppose, there. But not just casually cruel. Yeah, you see the distinction. So the villain is, or the evil person is, wicked, and they usually revel in their wickedness. And I'm not saying she doesn't, the niece doesn't revel in her wickedness, but this is a casual social cruelty to this is a guy who's come down for a nerve cure. So this is a guy with anxiety, and she presumably knows that or fishes that out. And the niece, who's 15 years old, deliberately upsets him, but very casually, very casually. And it's no big deal, is it? I mean, so she scared him about ghosts, and it's a sort of cruel trick that casually might be played. But I think what's interesting, and the point I'm labouring as usual, is that this isn't a wicked protagonist. This is somebody who's just off the cuff cruel, but it works really well. It works really well, and it leads us down the garden path of a supernatural story, and then twists it and makes us go ha ha ha, or oh, or whichever reaction you've had, or I'm bored by that, depending on who you are. Now, his most famous stories include this one, The Open Window. We've done Music on the Hill on this, well, I've done this on this channel, Tobermory, which I haven't done, Shredni Vashta, which I haven't done, but is really famous, and you can find it all over YouTube of people narrating it. Some of the people who narrate it are human as well. So, and he'd collected short stories. Reginald, 1904. Reginald in Russia, 1910. Beasts and Super Beasts, great title, 1914. Still widely read today. He wrote some novels, The Unbearable Bassington, When William Came, in 1913, being a satirical novel about the German invasion, which is ironic. So, despite his acerbic wit and often cynical worldview in his writing, Saki was known to be a kind and generous person in his personal life. He never married, and there's been speculation about his sexuality, though little concrete evidence exists either way. If you look online, it's kind of widely assumed he was gay, but I don't know that there's any evidence, as he says in my notes. He says, the guy who wrote the notes, there's no evidence. So at the outbreak of World War One, he was 43, and so officially over age. He didn't have to go in the, and this is a gentleman, you know, this is a man who's been born to, you know, people who went out to the colonies were not generally the working classes. They owned tea plantations and rubber plantations, and if they weren't, and they were aspiring, I guess, and they came back usually with some money. And it sounds like I mean, that he travelled Europe and he became a journalist. He wasn't a poor man. The point about this is he probably could have, because he was a gentleman, he could have enlisted as an officer, but he enlisted as a private in the Royal Fusiliers, and he refused a commission. So something going on there. He wrote for the Morning Post, who knows, and was eventually promoted to Lance Sergeant. So on the 14th of November 1916, while serving in France, he was killed by a German sniper. His last words were reportedly, "Put that bloody cigarette out." So a very interesting man, and a really interesting style of writing, I think. Yeah, a witty writer. I mean, in a sense, you think of somebody like E.F. Benson, who also wrote satirical, not the Edwardian gentry, but I think E.F. Benson is kinder in his writing. He's not as bitchy, if you like. I don't know if that's a right word, but certainly pointed. Okay. Anyway, let's talk about the second dude, who is Robert Murray Gilchrist. And despite his very Scottish-sounding name, he was born in Sheffield. I can't do a South Yorkshire accent, you know. If I've had a drink, I probably can. But so he was born 1867, like we said. And he spent much of his life in the rugged landscape of the Peak District, which is a kind of part of the Pennines that lies between some of the big cities in the North Midlands, South North, if you like. So Sheffield, in Derbyshire, and bordering on Staffordshire, and bordering on Cheshire, and of course Yorkshire. Anyway, very different kind of writing, of course. Whereas Saki comes across as quite a modern writer. He's not over the top, is he? He's not super Gothic. And this is a guy who was a contemporary pretty much exactly with Robert Murray Gilchrist. And that's interesting because Robert Murray Gilchrist is super Gothic, and deliberately Gothic. His ornate language. He's sort of like Swinburne, or he's reaching back to these Victorian poets, and he's Ernest Dowson or somebody like that in his language. Almost a little bit Oscar Wilde, but without... I mean, Wilde has very beautiful writing, and also a very sardonic and witty and sarcastic wit in his writing as well. So in that sense, Wilde kind of bridges the two authors, bridges Saki and Robert Murray Gilchrist. You know, literary experts may disagree with me, and I'm not going to defend that position. It just occurred to me there. So he was really popular. He began writing in the 1890s in earnest, and he produced some of his most notable works, particularly Gothic and supernatural fiction, and his short stories, which often featured elements of folklore and the uncanny set against the backdrop of the Derbyshire countryside. Now, he's very interested in topography. You can see that because he describes the landscape, doesn't he? And he uses the place names and he a use of place names. So I really like that because I like the use of place in stories as well, and it roots a story. Although it's interesting because he's rooted the story in real places, but they're not real. It's like what I mean is he takes the day-to-day, ordinary Derbyshire places and makes them weird, which I think's great. Actually, it's not even folk horror. It isn't folk horror. It's gothic. It's gothic. It's colourful gothic, in super goth really, and but it kind of twists them. Is it Lovecraftian? Lovecraft takes, in some cases, real places. He usually changes the names, and he makes some ordinary places gothic. But I think Robert Murray Gilchrist is right out and out about doing it, and he's bold in his doing it, isn't he? I just think it's really interesting the way he does it, and I like his language. It allows me to go super ham, a super ham actor. When I was at school, and I was in amateur dramatics, you may not be surprised to hear that. I was, yeah, ham. And when I played, also this is not related, apart from it happened when I was at school. I was very bad at football. You know, I'm talking about soccer, and I've got very poor eye hand coordination. I don't know where the ball is or anything like that. And all I could do was barge people. So I was a really rough player. And in a sense, my acting was the same. There was no finesse to it. It was just turn up the volume, turn up the ham, and I think I did that in this story, which I enjoyed marvelously. I liked both stories a lot, actually. They were different. Anyway, let's go on with his life. So he writes stories. He wrote novels such as Willowbreak, 1898, The Labyrinth, 1902, and he was most famous for his short stories. And he was really famous in his time, and then after he died it kind of disappeared, but there's been a more renewed interest in his contributions to the Gothic and supernatural recently, and a number of his works have been reprinted, including this one. Like, this is a is it Wordsworth, the Wordsworth Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural. Wordsworth Editions, they produced a whole bunch of reprints of Victorian and Edwardian and early 20th century, I suppose, post-Edwardian ghost and horror story writers. And I got a whole bunch of them from a bookshop in Aberystwyth, actually, a couple of years ago. Anyway, so during his lifetime, he had a long-term relationship with a man called George Garfit, and he lived for many years in the village of, I'll never say this properly, Aham, Derbyshire. And this was not discussed during his lifetime, but of course scholars are interested in it now because of our interest in gender and sexuality now. And he also, so he was definitely a 90%, 95%. Again, like with Saki, no, we haven't got any photographs and videos. Sorry about that. So he died when he was only 50, 1917. So he was 48. Saki was, I think. And we don't know how he died because we just don't have any documentation. I'm guessing if we went on ancestry.com we could probably find a death certificate for him, but I haven't done that. So he's only 50 and he died, but he suffered from poor health towards the end. He was in good connections with literary figures of his time, including Edward Carpenter and Bram Stoker. I think that was, he's super gothic. Both of them really good. Bundled them together. It's still only, even with me yattering on, it's still only going to be short of 40 minutes. So I hope that's okay.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?